I want to just let you know a little bit about Gloria Browne Marshall. And the way I was introduced to Gloria was through the National Women's Political Caucus. Let me just tell you that. So the secretary of the National Women's Political Caucus, Relissa Galloway Perry, called me one day and she said, "There's someone I want you to meet. She's a playwright, she's a civil rights attorney, she's an author, she is a college professor, and she has a lot going on. She's written some books, specifically the one that Relissa first mentioned to me was She Took Justice." And so I said, I'd love to meet her. We met virtually because it was during COVID. And we hit it off. And so she's one of the most talented women that I've ever met. She is the author of A Protest History of the United States. And because that is so important to what we're dealing with today, from a historical standpoint to today, I thought it would be very, very important for us to have Gloria come and share some thoughts with us about her book. She also is the author of the Report of the Status of Black Women and Children, Black Women and Girls. So if anybody is interested in knowing a little bit more about this, please let me know, and I'll make sure that you know how you can get this. But what's important to know about this book, and we have books in the back for you to purchase, is that the National Women's Political Caucus is in this book. So I was reading it and I said, "Ooh, Gloria Steinem, Shirley Chisholm, National Women's Political Caucus." So without further ado, I'd like to bring up my friend, the amazing attorney, playwright, author, and professor, Gloria Browne Marshall.
I'm gonna stand.
Okay. Thank you.
Power to the people. Power to the people. Power to the people. Thank you so much for having me come to speak with you today. I truly appreciate it. And as was pointed out, that Deidre and I, have known each other over several years, but however, my first time speaking to the National Women's Political Caucus was in 2021 with Dr. Carmen. I was on Zoom. Yes, that was me. I know I look taller in real life. Okay. Yes, that was me. I was on, and I was speaking about voting rights then. And so that was my first experience. And since that time, I don't see her here from Long Island. But since that time period, I have been very much engaged in these conversations, to the point where I started working on a protest history of the United States many years ago. Some people ask me, did I write it in January with the election? No, I did not write this 300-plus page book in January, but I wrote it at a time period in which people thought protest was ineffective. And so they asked the question, why should we protest? They thought we were in this post-Obama, time period in which everything was going to work out well. And so they thought even when we protested, it didn't really matter because protests didn't really do anything. And I thought about one woman in New York I was told about, who was a grassroots organizer and protester for many years, who died without enough money for a casket. And I thought about all these people who, like she was not somebody who was nationally known. She had worked in her community in Brooklyn over many, many years. And I thought about their sacrifice of lives and livelihoods that have taken place over the decades. And then I said, protest is effective. Litigation, for those lawyers in the room, is part of protest, depending on how you use it. Remember the ACLU doing its litigation? That's protest. So I thought of legislation, the people who are actually working on legislative agendas to expand progressive ideals against a tidal wave of negativity and conservatism, to stand up for those values is protest. Protest takes many different forms. And so one thing I wanted to do in this book was to expand the idea of protest, expand it in this way. Look at it this way. Protest, yes, indeed, it is standing in the street with a sign, shoulder to shoulder, with voices crying out for change. But wasn't protest also Rosa Parks not giving up her seat? So if protest can be taking a knee, if protest can be standing up or being quiet with one's fist in the air, protest can be many things. And so as we expand the idea of protest to include many ways in which we can have our voices heard, or the Tinker's case in which we had high school students wear a black armband to protest the Vietnam War. It can take so many different forms that there is always a space for someone to protest in their own way, as long as you understand, as Audre Lorde said, your silence will not protect you. I continue to do this work. I was just in Cleveland last night at the National Association of Black Journalists. The night before that, I was in Dallas. And I had the opportunity to speak to two white older females. They call themselves older white ladies. That's how they refer to themselves, so I'm not throwing any shade. And they said, we're conservative Christians, supporter of Trump. But we want to know, it's two of them that came together, we want to know why you're angry. Why are people protesting? So I have been able to travel around the country, and will continue to travel around the country, talking with different groups. I was in New Mexico in July. I've been in DC and other places like that, and I will continue to travel around the country on this book tour that's also a tour in which I get to hear what people have to say and continue to speak out. And I've had a friend of mine say yesterday, he was at my book talk in Cleveland, he said, what you're doing is rather dangerous. Do you have security? And what I said in Dallas, this is what I said in Dallas, and I've said this many other places that are kind of on the dicey side. I said, you know what? I try to know where the door is, and I try to understand that even at this age, y'all might rush the stage, but 3 of y'all ain't going home tonight. So I don't know. I don't know which 3. Y'all can draw straws. I don't care, but 3 of y'all are not going home tonight. I can't take on everybody. 3 of y'all are going to leave here with some scratches. So, but I also, on a serious note, think about Breonna Taylor. And in my book, I talk about the fact that someone wrote on the building, I live in New York City, someone wrote on a building across from my building in 15-foot white letters, Breonna. And every morning I would get up and look at that name, and it moved me to the point that I actually put it in my book, because somebody in their way of protesting put her name on that wall for people to remember her. And so when I do this work, I think Breonna, for those of you who say rest is resistance, well, she was resting, wasn't she? She was in her own home when those bullets took her life. So I think I'd rather be out speaking on my feet than living on my knees. That's the way I see it. So I want to tell you a little bit about my book before I read a couple of passages, because I know I want to have a book signing about 2:30, might end up being 2:40, but I also want to, by expanding that time period, give you time to ask questions. It's one way in which I can be a conduit going forward into other communities across the country as I speak about protest, helping them to better understand why we are protesting, why protest matters and is still an effective tool, and in some way pay homage to the ancestors that allowed us to be in this room today. Because there was protest that took place or we would not be here. I want you to understand there was protest that took place, or you would not be in this room. There were women, men, and others who did something, remember, quietly perhaps, but it might have been a big splash back then. Some of them lost their jobs. Some of them had to move out of the neighborhood. And that's why in what I do in this book, I start with the indigenous, who I believe are the original protesters for this country, as they protested for culture and land, or over that issue. Then I speak of the slave uprisings as protests, as well as petitions of the enslaved and the abolitionists as protests. We go on into the women's movement, of course, as protests in the different ways in which women have had to protest. Anti-war protests and resistance and demonstrations, as well as labor protests, because to join a union is to protest your work conditions. It is to say, I want to stand up and be counted as a full human being, not just a tool on the conveyor belt. So in order for us to have unions, we had to have people who were willing to put lives and livelihoods on the line. And so I speak of Mother Jones and other people who have been forgotten about in the union labor movement. I go through the protests around police-involved civilian deaths, because that is important, and that's where Breonna Taylor and others like her come into the fore, and George Floyd, as we know. And then I end in climate change, and something that some people may know better than others, and that's urban renewal. And you might think, well, why is urban renewal a point of protest? Well, for many Black and brown communities, urban renewal is also known as Negro removal, because it was through our neighborhoods that the freeways were placed. Our neighborhoods were raised. Central Park used to be a Black community called Seneca Village. And the people there were forced out, and that's how they created Central Park. So there were many protests that have taken place over many ways in which we view America. Next year is going to be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I would ask you, young people, as well as anyone else, who in here has actually read the Declaration of Independence? So you know how they refer to indigenous people in that document, and what they wanted, and what this country was about. So there is this conflict, this dualism, this personality disorder in this country, in which you have the United States of America. The United States, and I'm going to say things in gendered measures, I apologize in advance, but it's the best way I can do it. The United States of America, the United States is male, capitalist, empire building, soul crushing, looking to make a dollar in any way it can. It will take people, as it has, from another continent and sell them and their children for free labor. America, the Statue of Liberty, says, give me your huddled masses yearning to be free, yearning to breathe free. Come here, liberty and justice for all. You come here, and the United States then makes you have crippling labor of 16, 18 hours a day. America says, you can have your choice. You have a voice. You have free speech. The United States says, we will kill you if you protest. This is all in one country. So if you've ever felt confused, please know they were confused from the very beginning. America says that one has free speech and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievance. Then the nation's arrogant other half, the United States, calls on law enforcement to quash challenges by citizen and immigrant alike, fixed on raw avarice and delusions of superiority. Between these battling Goliaths stand the nation's huddled masses, and among them, the activists who believe enough in the uplift of regular human beings to resist, push, and protest for progress. Throughout this book, the use of America reflects the full name of the country, the United States of America. It draws on this dualism between the nation's ideal of liberty for all and its history of narcissistic capitalism. One side of this country's personality extends a right to protest, and the other gives the reason. So when we think about what we're doing as women, it is something that is in many ways antithetical to why we were here in the first place. Why? Because our wombs are a battleground. Our wombs were never meant to be controlled by us. From the very beginning of this country, before it was a country, into the 1600s, and I know you already know all this, you know that Jamestown settlement, which is where our country begins, not Plymouth Rock. Please don't tell me anybody thinks our country began in Massachusetts. It did not. It began in Virginia in 1607 as a Jamestown settlement. It was the colony where King James said, all the other monarchs have something in a new world. I want something too. So England actually came late to the game. Portugal began. And then Spain, France, the rest of them. But England, the reason why we speak English, everywhere you go, there's an English colony where they speak English as a first language. England said, we will now start a colony in the New World, and we will go someplace that there are no native people, because they knew there were native people there. They arrived in 1607. Africans arrived in this colony in 1619. The Mayflower landed in 1620. We were here before the Mayflower. And it was there, going forward, that you have these men who got lonely. And they started looking at the women. And the women who were there in the greatest numbers were the indigenous women. So we think about diversity. Diversity was there in the very beginning. You had the indigenous people, you had the African people, and you had the Europeans all there. This is about power. It's about power. We always had diversity. It's about power. So where do the women come in? Female reproduction is a power that has for too long been controlled by men. For much of history, whether they were in positions of authority, servitude, or bondage, women were focused on as reproductive places because of wombs, and our wombs were empire builders. You could have all of these men, but you need baby colonists. And without women, you couldn't build an empire. Men had used this weapon for thousands of years in order to expand territory, sustain nations, become wealthy, inflict cruelty, and reproduce, thereby making workers, soldiers, heirs. In colonial America and later the United States, white women were expected to produce a population to sustain this nation. Their white wombs were commercial and political investments, weaponized to give birth to the dominators of this stolen land. Indigenous women were targeted for sterilization, starvation, and massacres, while enslaved African women were forced to produce children to further European and then American empires. This process began when women, along with men, were kidnapped from Angola, brought to the newly settled Virginia colony. Angela, or Angelo, was the first recorded African woman in the colony. Indigenous and African women variously endured, resisted, and challenged and fought the laws of violence, subjugating them and their wombs. Under less repressive conditions, but still contending with misogyny, the upper-class European and American wives of tycoons were expected to produce male heirs to carry on the family pedigree. To supply the workforce and the military, women on both sides of the Atlantic were expected to have multiple births while suffering the heavy burden of high infant mortality. The womb has always been a battleground. So this is not new. We have been battling over control of our wombs since the 1600s when it comes to American history. And I'll go with this quote. In the summer of 1620, and this is a quote from Brendan Wolfe, In the summer of 1620, the Virginia Company of London announced that it would send, quote, 800 choice persons, half of whom were assigned to be tenants of company land. 100 young maids were sent to make wives for these tenants, and 100 boys to serve as apprentices. Finally, 100 servants were to be disposed among the old planters, which they greatly desired. So this is what we were. We were shipped here as women, and I say this we, from the Queen's we, shipped here as women to be wives and to have babies. Why is this important in this time? Because my sisters and my brother, we are in a period of nationalism. The fear of 2045 is what is fueling this political conservative agenda. You're going to have conversations around 2045. Because in the year 2045, this nation is going to be majority people of color. I'll say it again for those who didn't know or forgotten. By the year 2045, this nation is going to be majority people of color. And it is scaring the hell out of a lot of people. I knew this 15 years ago. Back then it was 2050. And by the time we get closer, it might end up being 2042. That's why you're seeing deportations. That's why you're seeing, I don't know if you've read about this $5,000 bonus to be paid to women to have babies. But they're not wanting to pay this for Latinas to have babies, for indigenous to have babies, for African American women to have babies. No, they've got prison systems for them and deportation. They need some white babies. And that's why they're making it difficult for white women to continue their careers. If you ever wonder, well, why don't they just have child care? Why don't they just expand the minimum wage? Why don't they just, underneath, do things that would help support women in their careers? Because once a woman has a career and once she starts working on her own, then she starts to delay having children, and she then has fewer children. And they want to force women to have babies, thus the undermining of Roe versus Wade. When you start seeing how the systems have worked to maintain patriarchy of the older white male, then you see, and I'm going to just throw this out here very quickly, I'm going to take it back, why they don't care about what happened to the women in the Epstein scandal, of the girls. Because if you start thinking from their perspective, what is a female but a pleasure object? They don't have real feelings. So when you start to understand the opposition, because one person said earlier today, they studied us and we need to study them. Have we studied them? The speaker before me said, have you studied the people in your district? We need to be studying our opposition. They studied us over time. That's why they were able to come in and attack the way they did. They attacked in all of these different areas. They used military precision and shock and awe military tactic. The late Colin Powell wrote an autobiography, and I had the opportunity to read it. And in his autobiography, he spoke of going to military college. And in military college, General Powell wrote that they have the opportunity to study every battle since Hannibal, the losing battles and the winning battles. And they study the tactics, and they take what wins, and they study the other side to know where the weaknesses are and how to attack. Have we studied? These people may seem invincible, but I know for a fact as a believer that God does not reside at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So that means these people are mortal. We need to find their mortal weaknesses. We need to find the openings for attack. We have three branches of government. We have three branches of government. And with those three branches of government, the founders thought, the framers of the U.S. Constitution in 1787 when it was drafted, 1789 when it was ratified, the First Amendment in 1791 when it was ratified, that there would be this overlapping of the branches. We know that. But they feared a king. So if they had devised such a wonderful constitutional system for a government, why did they fear the return of a king? Because they knew it was possible. Not probable, but possible. So what do we have? The First Amendment, which gives freedom of speech, freedom of peaceable assembly, and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, the right to petition, to ask the government for a redress, a remedy of grievances, complaints. That is the last line of the First Amendment. It's the people who will be the last push before we go into authoritarianism. The people. Power to the people. Power to the people. Power to the people. Power to the people. I stand for questions.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Leslie Palmer. I'm with Sacramento Caucus and also the Capital Women's Campaign. Thank you. That was quite inspirational. And I'm curious, is the part about studying the opposition in your book?
I wrote the book with the idea that in reading it, you would see it, but no. I don't.
Okay.
I have like 2 or 3 lines, but it's not that type of book. It actually is a storytelling of different protests and protesters over a 500-year period. And in it, I intertwine my family's history of my great-great-grandmother, Eliza, who was enslaved in Kentucky and then was an exoduster to Kansas. So I was actually born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri. Yes. Went to Southwest High School in Kansas City. So, yes, and I live in New York now, but I also lived in Pennsylvania and Alabama and other places. So it would be difficult for me to go into depth about studying the opposition, but that's something actually I wish I would have focused more on given the talks that I've had.
Yeah, because, I'd say about 15 years ago, my father-in-law made a point of sending me a series of books. I think they were written by Les Brown and another group on global economic and climate changes and all those things. And one of the big ones was on the minority becoming majority. And you're right, 2050. And so I hadn't really thought about it that much until a couple nights ago. I was talking to somebody, and now you brought it up. And that's very powerful to put it in that context. But my real question was, and it was kind of related to the previous speaker, was somebody had challenged me on the concept of being woke. And I'm curious how you respond to that, because the person who asked me about that lives in a state where I think they're in the Trump bubble. So they get bad news and all that, and they just believe a bunch of weird stuff. But and I think I answered him in a good way that made him think. But I'm curious if that comes up for you and what you respond, how you respond.
Martin Luther King said, "Stay awake." And yes, so that to me means stay enlightened. But I was on a radio program and I was talking about racial justice, and I had 2 African-American conservatives say, "Oh, you're going to use the race card." And I said, "I'm going to use the card I've been dealt." So don't let people steal your words. Don't let them throw them back at you like you're going to be wounded. I am a very proud African-American woman. So Yes, and I think women should stand up as women, and that's why I love being in this group. It's really inspiring me even more to stand up in defense of our womanhood. You know, we're not women by accident, even though some people could say that genetically, biologically, but you know, this sense of who we are as women, what we bring to the table as a woman, I think is very important. So whether or not it's stay woke, and here's another book, you know, outside of mine, that you should get, and that is Martin Luther King's book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? Where do we go from here, chaos or community? And in this book, Martin Luther King said that this country does not truly believe in democracy, because if it had to choose, it would refrain from democracy if it meant equality. He said this in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, in 1967. He wrote this in 1967. So what we're seeing is the knowing, as they do, that this country is going to be majority people of color. And you need, I think, to have these conversations with certain people because they're not going to be talking about it. And we're not talking about it. We have to figure out how we're going to have these conversations because some white liberals are afraid of that. Some people have not ever been a minority in any environment. So, and then I'm going to say this because it needs to be said. There are many white people who think that people of color, especially African Americans, are going to do to them what they did to us. Let's be very clear. No one's saying these things. They need to be said because we can't have the type of honest conversations that can empower us if we're not going to say some things that need to be said. So, I mean, I believe stay woke is very important, just like they've changed diversity, equity, and inclusion into something horrible. Don't let them do it. And actually, somebody told me, and I think that's really viable too, is to use diversity, equity, and inclusion instead of DEI, because some people don't even know what DEI stands for. So he's like, oh, you're against diversity, equity, and inclusion? Is that what you're against? And so, and then I think it's, as we build our coalition and we have these discussions, some people are just not going to be on board. And you have to figure out how you're going to use your time, money, and energy. And for me, I sometimes decide this is no longer worth my energy. Those two white women in Dallas, you know, we spent 20 minutes talking. And they still left, but they bought a book. So hopefully, you know, but hopefully they will read it in their own homes in their own time. And that's why I think it's also important. What you say to somebody, they have time to ruminate on. They may argue, but as an educator, I know that I could say something today that stays in someone's mind later. They need to ruminate on it. So sometimes arguing back and forth does not get you anywhere. You say your piece, they say their piece. We can say, okay, let's agree to disagree, but just think about what I said. And y'all say, I'll think about what you're saying. And then you let it go. Okay?
Thank you. I'm wondering, we see a lot of protest activity be scrutinized, analyzed, but I think more quickly judged. And I wanted to get your take on what was the most maybe misunderstood of the social movements or protest activities that you evaluated throughout history, and how the course of history has allowed us to see and understand that work differently now.
Thank you so much. And it's part of the reason why I wrote this book, that these people had strategies. They had an end goal they were trying to meet. It wasn't just going out in the street. In the very beginning, take George Floyd, because it's the most recognized at this point. Initially, it was the anger and the frustration. But then people learned, what is my policy change I want to make? What do I want to do? Because it's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Our vision of the world is not someone else's vision. So as we work toward our vision, they're working toward their vision. So it's not going to stay in place. It's always going to be challenged the same way we're challenging theirs. They had strategy, very specific strategies they put in place. Whether or not it was a sit-in, what was the goal of the sit-in? Jail, no bail. It was to fill up the jails so that would bring attention to what was taking place. The protest is supposed to disrupt. Are we disrupting? Or are we just emoting and having really great signs? We have to disrupt, and we have to educate those people who are not at the protest. So messaging, as I said earlier, messaging is very important. What is the message you want to convey, and what do you want somebody else to do? That's also important. You want them to vote for a different law or vote somebody out of office? Do you want them to initiate a particular policy? We have plenty of laws in the books, and I give you this example, the 8-hour workday. We wake up with the 8-hour workday. Do you even know how you got it?
Unions
And people dying.
Yeah.
When I was in Chicago, the Haymarket riots, that they called them the riots, but it was an uprising. People died. The 8-hour workday was on the books in the 1800s. It didn't come to be until the 1900s. That's why you can have laws on the books, but without somebody protesting to make them a reality, that's all they are, words on paper. We wake up every day wrapped in what has been gained through protest, large and small, those in the streets and those very quietly done behind closed doors. Figure out the way in which you're going to make your voice heard, and you'll realize that somebody invested in having this room filled with women from all these places. People who never knew our names. There's this phrase, and I always mess it up. It's something like, plant the seeds for a tree that will produce shade you'll never feel. Are we willing to invest in a future that we will not see? That's what we're living off of right now, and some of us are freedom freeloaders. We are freedom freeloaders. We're riding the coattails of other people who fought and died and sacrificed and did many things, most of them unknown. They didn't know our names, and yet we want to just live our lives with that without putting something in the pot, and not just for our families and our friends, but people somewhere who will never know our names.
I want to thank you. I'm really interested now in reading your book.
Thank you. I came all this way.
Because history matters, and you know that, and I know that. But we know that most people don't even know what their unconscious bias is. And I totally agree that there is a fear by white males that something's going to be taken away from them because they're used to just walking their entitled bodies into room and not ever having fear of anything, not having a fear that people of color do. But a lot of us come from different marginalized communities. And it seems that we, as a Native American, I have my thing, right? But we really need in this moment to coalesce around a message, around something that's unifying, because there are more of us than them. But the white patriarchy has done a really good job at making us fight one another, okay? And making us fear one another. And I'm just kind of with your knowledge of the historical perspective, do you see a path that we can start taking when we leave this room?
I will say, I'm going to put some suggestions out there. For those of you who want to do the actual physical protesting, sit-in is the thing that's being missed. And I've talked to activists from back in the day, and they were like, you don't see sit-ins, and that needs to happen. Divide and conquer is a viable strategy to crush uprisings, to crush people who want to do things that are progressive. And the only force against it is unity. Unity will defeat divide and conquer. And that's why the unions were so important. Unity will defeat divide and conquer. So what is the commonality? Protesting against something, as was pointed out, that's one part. But we have to be protesting and moving towards something. And since we're now talking about 2045, I think we should be moving toward community power. Community power. And in that word community, you have unity. Community power. I've had people say, but my issue is Gaza. My issue over here is immigration. Another issue is women's rights. Another issue is black rights, voting rights. So we have to find what is that common part that we all have that's across the board, and that we are a community. Whereas the United States thought is that this is a hierarchy, and there are people who are supposed to be at the top, and there are people in the middle and at the bottom, and you fight for the bottom space. Who's going to be at the very bottom? Who's going to be next to the bottom? But community is something that we need to be thinking about. Community 2045. And what are our basic things that we need? Someone mentioned earlier, children, literacy, health, housing. These are things that go across the board that don't have as much of a party connected to it, even though they've been all weaponized. But we have to figure out where are the people who are able to connect around those basic types of community things. So yes, I do feel we need a message going forward, and I think that's where our party, the Democratic Party, for those who are Democrats as well as independents, that's where things are failing. There's no message forward, there's just a protest against. So we need to make our own message forward for 2045, but then that means we have to realize it's going to be a 2045. Thank you for that air conditioning. That we have to realize that there's going to be a 2045, and that we have to begin to think about community and having this broader sense of what America is.
Okay, so two things. It was mentioned that whites fear African American will do to them what has been done to them. There is no historical data anywhere, no history, that shows African Americans attacking whites or any other minority group. There's no history, no data, no.
What's your question?
I'm making a point because you said one of the things that people fear,
yes,
and I'm saying that's not a necessary fear.
Yes, you know what? Fear is not necessarily rational. That's what makes it a fear.
Well, I'm pointing out it's unnecessary fear. The second thing I have to say is about DEI. There has been many people who think that African Americans and minorities have benefited from DEI. African Americans have only benefited 4%. 4%. Everybody else has benefited. Every race, handicap, LGBT, everybody. African Americans are at 4%. Even though it appears that we are the ones who are targeted because of DEI. And Deidre's Madam President's only taking 2 more questions.
Okay, here's what very clearly I must have been, mistaken in what I said. I'm saying what that fear is. I'm not saying it's rational. Okay, the other is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want to give this quick example. When the plane and the helicopter collided in Washington, D.C., we watched this loop and felt heartbroken for those people. And then this guy, says it was because of DEI. I waited for my allies to speak up. I heard nothing. So I led a protest on President's Day from New York and New Jersey with other co-leaders to protest being blamed for this crash. So as they use DEI, we may look at it and say we didn't benefit that much, but it's become a code word for black people. Okay? So then I need you as allies, when you're in the room and you hear this happening, you're going to have to speak up. Because I can't be everywhere. We can't be in every room, and you're going to be in rooms that I am not able to enter, or they're going to pretend like everything is fine. What is your responsibility going into these rooms as allies for women of color? That's very important. Okay,
Thank you, Missouri again. And I just wanted to confirm what you were talking about with the 2045, 2050 date. As someone who's living it in Missouri, we have seen our representatives on live streaming on the literally admitting to the fact that they're worried about having more white babies. They quote the Bible incessantly. Last session or this session, they were working on passing a bill, and I believe they did, to allow doctors to use religious objections so they don't have to provide certain medical care. So if they decide they don't want to provide abortion, whether it's legal or not, they don't have to. So they are putting it in play. Again, we're in the middle, we're in the Bible Belt, they are doing this, it is coming. And then on top of that, and how we're handling this with protests, we're circling back. I know that there are what I maybe oversimplify to two theories of protesting, right? You have the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King way, which I've always viewed as the passive, the permissive, the turn the other cheek. And then you had, which is more my speed, the brother Malcolm X, who is more in your face, get into it, who I think raised very good, relevant questions about white liberals and the threat that they pose to moving things forward. I was just curious what your thoughts are on that as far as, should this be a combination of both approaches? Do we need good cops, bad cops, people who are in your face, agitators, and then the people you should come to the table to negotiate with in your...
I think that the reason why I wrote this book is because I wanted you to see the many ways in which protests have been used over time. You decide what works out best for you, but do something. There are artists who are protesting. They protest through poetry, through painting, through music. There are many ways in which people have protested. I gave a talk in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and one of the attendees was upset because I didn't have Pete Seeger in the book. And you say, but Pete Seeger should be in your book because he was a musical genius who was also a protester, internationally known. He was very upset. And of course, I didn't miss the point that, he had a book on Pete Seeger. But the other way you can protest, and this is somewhere that's very personal, the holidays are coming up. And many people will sit there and listen to racist Uncle Joe say all types of things and not say a bloody word. You can protest in your own home based on your beliefs and tell Uncle Joe, I don't want to hear it. But many of us will say, I don't want to start an argument. I don't want to start an argument. I don't want any friction. And yet you want other people to have friction. You want other people to do things. So you want to outsource your protest voice. Freedom, freeloaders. Yes, it's one thing to go do something with strangers. What are you doing in your own homes? How are you going to handle these holidays coming up for the next 6 months? You're going to sit there and let them say anything just to keep the peace? Going back to that question, I believe there's a combination. For them to have violence given to them, nonviolence is a strategy because the person who's been hit doesn't hit back. So violence is taking place. And when I had the chance to be in Selma, Alabama a few months ago for the 60th anniversary of the March Across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, one thing that the elders who were high school students, that's going back to the youth question we had before, these were high school students who after school would take classes in nonviolent protests. High school students who were arrested because if their parents had been arrested, the whole family income would be gone. That's why the high school students did so much. That's why John Lewis, you knew him for such a long period of time because he started protesting when he was 15 years old. So that's why he was leading a protest across the Edmund Pettus Bridge when he was 24. So at this point, I want us to think about our families, think about the places, proselytize if you have to as your form of protest. You don't have to go out in the street, but if you can around the Thanksgiving table, or the barbecue, or anything else that you have, keep your values when you're interacting with your relatives and friends, then you have to ask yourself, how much do I want this? Because they are going to push you to the brink and you've got to learn to push back. And if that's the Malcolm X part, then you need to download a couple of Malcolm X speeches and find out. The other thing I found out through my research, not only did they have the strategies, they had a level of courage because they knew these people would hurt them. This wasn't that people say, oh, well, Donald Trump's people will hurt us if we go out and protest. Those black people knew that the sheriff was going to send his people to hurt them. So that's why I tell protesters, especially young people, do not protest at night. When you get close to, know what time the sun is going down before you even go out there. Know who's leading this protest. If you feel awkward in any way, step away from it. Have the telephone number of the lawyer or ACLU written on your skin or on your clothes. Do not have it just in your phone. They will take your phone if you are arrested. And then you won't have those numbers because nobody knows the telephone number anymore anyway. So you have to write it on something that's going to be with you. Have a lawyer and have somebody else with money have the bond money. So when you make that call, they already have the bail money right there, ready to go. Who's going to be the lawyer? The lawyer should not be in the protest. It doesn't help the protest if the lawyer's in the cell next to yours, okay? So you have to find out if it's not the ACLU, and the ACLU actually has on its website things to do at a protest. It's listed there for you. Call them, say, I'm in a town here. What's the closest person or group that will help me? I'm about to participate in a protest. And also, what they had back then, as I told you, was a goal. In order to find out if your protest is actually working, one, you don't protest on Friday and think that change is going to take place on Monday. That's not the way most protests work. The other is for young people who use social media. Social media from your living room can be a part of protest, but it can't be the only way in which you protest. That's a safer way to protest. But I've seen flash mobs, fantastic use of social media. Flash mobs come because they have been given the place, the same way you have the party. Everybody, if Jay-Z's giving a party, old Jay-Z. But if Jay-Z was giving a party and somebody put it online, there you would know where to go. Then have a flash protest. Come in for an hour. Protest. Make sure the media knows so you get voices out there beyond the people who are already on your protest. Get the word out that messaging is so crucial. Be there for an hour, leave. And then pop up somewhere else. I say there's not been a protest at a grocery store, Trader Joe's, Target. There's not been a protest, and you can come in, sit at the checkout stand, stay there, cause a disruption, get your message out, leave before the police arrive. Or if somebody's going to decide who's going to get arrested, then let that person get arrested. They used to choose in anti-war protests. They would choose who was going to be arrested. So there are ways in which this has happened. I'm sorry, I've gone over time.
Gloria,
Yes.
so just want you to know we have one final question,
Okay.
but everybody that wants to buy a book, she's going to be signing books. So come on and line up, but we have one final question. We'll start our plenary session at 3:15. Okay? Lita?
Hello, Lita, California.
Thank you.
Ah.
I got too excited. I'm sorry, it was the air conditioning.
Not at all. It fits right into my question. What is the chink in their armor that we need to head for first?
I would say unelecting people. We have to look at who we can unelect.
Exactly.
Okay? So as was stated earlier, who's vulnerable for unelection? And then go after them. They're not the only people who can primary somebody. Are we even thinking about whom we can primary? Are we using that type of power in that way? I think that's very important. And so if we start focusing that protest, I've seen protesters that were protesting at the Capitol on a Sunday. No one's there. Who are you trying to speak to? Who are you influencing? So, there is a phrase, no justice, no peace. We need to take away their peace. There's an old saying that, people go home picking at their dinner because of what happened that day. You need to send all these people home picking at their dinner. Give them no peace. That is so important as a protest. Be all these places that would make them feel uncomfortable on a public sidewalk, in a straight line, not blocking anything. But you have to take away their peace. They can't be comfortable in their oppression. Thank you so much.